Funding for current conversations is provided by the University of Oklahoma President's Office, the OU Office of Student Affairs, OU Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we're going to visit with Dr. Amer Ahmed. He deals with diversity issues at the University of Massachusetts. He is an expert on Islamophobia, and today we'll talk to him about the challenges of being a person from the Middle East in the U.S. Join us for this timely conversation. Would you talk a little about the work that you do at the University of Massachusetts?
Yeah, so I serve as Director of Intercultural Teaching and Faculty Development, but really I'm an internal diversity consultant for academic affairs. I work with the schools and colleges within the university to try to help them develop strategies to creating inclusive environments. I might be thinking about recruitment of students and faculty, and also, again, thinking about how do you create an inclusive environment where people can feel valued and respected in the classroom and the work environments and so forth.
I want to ask you about Islamophobia, which I don't think gets nearly enough discussion in America. Could I take you back? Could you give us an overview, at least from your perspective, of the issue of Islamophobia in America before 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, Islamophobia is a lot older than people realize. It really goes back to the Crusades. It goes back to the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain, and the impact that had on the rationale around colonialism and the sense of superiority of European and white colonizers in various parts of the world, including the Islamic world. But then as we move into kind of modern times, the late 20th century, early 21st century American society, we have immigration of people from all different parts of the world, many of whom are Muslim or many of whom are perceived as Muslim, and a sense of exotification, a sense of resistance, a rejection of the foreign other. And that was also happening alongside increases in Islam amongst African Americans. Islam really being something associating with Africa for many African Americans, reclaiming identity prior to slavery, and resisting oppression and so forth. And so we have a very diverse society, but overwhelmingly we're perceived as people of color and non-white. And that might not always be true, but that's how we're perceived. And so we experience a racialized dynamic in this country. And then with 9/11, all of that has been exacerbated.
But before we talk about post 9/11, all of what you're talking about, doesn't it go under that very large umbrella of Orientalism? And I just mention that because it's a huge umbrella, and there's reinforcement in the West from a lot of different directions to see Middle Eastern people as kind of bloodthirsty and outside of cultural renegades in some way, overly passionate.
Absolutely. In my talks, I always say everybody must read Orientalism by Edward Said. To learn and understand that distorted lens that Europe has had towards Eastern cultures, particularly Arab cultures. But, it's also the conflating. My family's from India, originally. And, we all kind of get grouped together. And, Islamophobia tremendously affects the Sikh community, which is a different religious group that originates from India. And the men wear turbans because they don't cut their hair. And ironically, most Muslims don't wear turbans, but they get perceived to be Muslim. And as a community, they're subjected as a proportion to more hate crimes than any community in this country.
It almost seems like a matter of sort of dark humor that all these people are being grouped into one stereotype, and the fit is not good at all. It makes no sense whatsoever.
You might remember a couple years back, the Miss America winner was the first South Asian American that ever won. She was actually one of my former students from University of Michigan, and she was bombarded with all these tweets saying that the Arab won and the terrorists have won and a Muslim won, and she's actually a Hindu American, but because she's brown, she's just grouped in with this, this foreign other Muslim threat, perceived Muslim threat that's, taking over America, supposedly imposing Sharia law and so forth. And And so, yeah, there's a belligerence to it.
Now, I have a feeling that you're going to say that after 9/11, all this gets amped up, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's best to speak from my own experience. I think, before 9/11, it was, there was a curiosity, there was a foreign otherness, there was a general experience of being a person of color and not white. But then, after 9/11, I mean, the intensity and the scrutiny, I mean, but before 9/11, a lot of people used to say, what's a Muslim? Like, a lot of people didn't even know what a Muslim was. But then after 9/11, people had very strong ideas of what they thought a Muslim was. And that impacted all different kinds of experiences that I was having. Certainly, in a post-Patriot Act era in which our civil liberties have been undermined, you can be held indefinitely without being charged, without access to a lawyer. The fear and the profiling, and I mentioned Muslims were really diverse. What's the racial profile for an American Muslim? We're all different kinds of people. So if you give the government carte blanche to basically say we can just round up whoever we want under racial profiling or just grouping people together, it's has dangerous implications for everybody.
Dangerous implications. I suspect that history is not going to be very kind about this period. That history is going to record a kind of attack on our deepest commitments and values expressed through Islamophobia and the racism you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that have happened since 9/11 has been one of the biggest allies to our community has been the Japanese American community, because they've seen this story before.
Been there, done that.
With having been interned
Right.
during World War II, they have seen the signs from the very beginning, and they've been very vocal about their concerns about the treatment of our community. Now we're seeing even more people standing with our community.
We had somebody on the show who had been interned in World War II, and the stories were just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
And then we sit with that fear that it's getting to that point. The rhetoric is so intense that it is creating the kind of fear in our community that something like that could somehow be possible at some point in the future.
It's possible that the presidential election coming up in November will be a fork in the road, right? We go one way, then we'll start maybe addressing this problem. If we go another, we may be just kind of throwing fuel on the flames.
Absolutely. I mean, during this presidential election, we've had declarations of banning Muslims from entering the country. But okay, so people might want to dismiss. They might say that's Donald Trump or whatever. There was a widespread acceptance of the idea of not accepting Muslim refugees. Jeb Bush was supportive of that. Lots of the presidential candidates were supportive of that. To having a religious test on the most vulnerable people on the planet and the most screened people on the planet. It's just, what is it saying about us as a country that we can't even accept refugees?
Well, it says we don't value our own Constitution, for one thing, because it would have been unconstitutional to do that.
Exactly.
I don't want to leave what you said before as just a generality about, acts of aggression and discrimination. Could you be as specific as you're comfortable being? Maybe some forms that microaggressions take, but also sort of other kinds of acts that people suffer from?
Yeah, so there's the random security check, which is not that random. I've experienced that.
Like in airports? Or?
Yeah. Every man in my family has been on a flight watch list at some point. My brother's sons, from the time they were 6 years old, they were on flight watch lists. So he used to show up at the airport, and they couldn't fly. They would take the IDs in the back, and if you ask questions, they yell at you. And so he used to have to go to the airport a day in advance to get his sons cleared. You're talking about children, But for me, my worst experiences have been when coming back into the country from somewhere else. I lived in Michigan. You want to go to Toronto or to Windsor. And then you think twice, do I really want to deal with that? And then, because there was definitely a period of time where every single time I was coming back into the country, I was getting stopped, they're going through all my stuff, they take my passport, and then still to this day, like every 1 or 2 times, it pretty much happens.
What about microaggressions in the workplace and social life? Maybe not just even your own, but ones you've observed or you know about.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of pathologizing of Muslims, that there's something inherently violent or suspicious. We're seeing it in the classroom and in higher education a lot. We're seeing it show up in terms of what faculty are saying, in curriculums, what students are saying in an unchecked way about Muslims, really blanket statements and non-factual statements. And it's being fed by a media that is really creating a deep distortion. You know, if we based Christianity and the only representation was of the Ku Klux Klan, you know, over and over again, we would think that that's a really odd representation of Christianity relative to what we know Christianity to be, for better or for worse of the complex world of Christianity.
It's a really good comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, is it really fair for me or anybody else who's Muslim to be, you know, measured by what ISIS does? And you know, and of course we know ISIS was born out of the failure of the Iraq War, and so, I mean, it is really sad, the narrowing, and I've talked also about how Islamophobia is not a partisan issue, and I mean, I'm really concerned about people like Bill Maher, who are these like flaming liberals, and he has a show that has about 4 million viewers every week, and he bashes Muslims every single week, and he's teaching liberals that, you know, we should make an exception when it comes to Muslims and Islam. And, you know, people say, oh, well, he hates all religion, but he specifically, him and people like Sam Harris and others, they very much pathologize Islam, that there's something inherent in Islam.
I haven't seen Bill Maher do that, and I'm really disappointed to hear that.
Yeah.
That sounds really ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what, like I said, that's part of the scary nature of it, is that we don't even know where to turn, you know, because it's coming at us from multiple directions right now, you know.
You were talking about microaggressions, and you made some references to campus life, university life. Let me turn that around just for a second, though. Don't most of us as educators have the hope that the campus environment is a place of opportunity? Because people's careers are being shaped, and to some degree their personalities and their identities, because students are so young. It also represents an opportunity to get some of these things right, the remedy, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's why I work in higher education, because I believe that American higher education, especially a liberal arts education, creates the opportunity for us to have conversations, for us to consider multiple perspectives, to be critical thinkers, to be empathetic, to educate for personal and social responsibility beyond your own individual self-interest. And so it's my hope, and that's why work, you know, is about trying to create environments where we can learn from each other in a safe way, in a way that's not hostile. It doesn't mean that we're not going to get uncomfortable and that we're not going to get challenged. We are, but we should be able to do that in a way that elevates all of us in our discourse.
We could probably generalize that race is America's most uncomfortable topic at this moment.
For many, yeah.
What's the experience on your campus? And I think you go to conferences and professionally active. What's your experience with meaningful racial dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of student activism happening right now, which is great. You know, it's wonderful. We want students to use their voice. There's, you know, the discourse of social justice has proliferated, and the language of it, like you just talked about microaggressions, and so these are becoming mainstream concepts and ideas, and it's good that we're doing that. But we also see this kind of resistance to political correctness that's happening in our country, and that resistance, I think, is a reaction to the fact that the policing of everything that everybody says, and the bashing of it. You know, the thing about higher education is that it's a learning environment, and you know, we need to be able to make mistakes. It doesn't mean that we enable them, we permit them just to go unchecked, but we need to be able to create environments in which, you know, if I as a straight person makes some kind of mistake about in my communication about sexual orientation, that it's a safe enough environment for me to be challenged on that, and for my learning and growth and development to be impacted in a way in which I can recognize that I might need to make some shifts to be able to make sure that I'm participating in an environment that's more inclusive for everybody.
Yeah, would you be willing to make a distinction, and I'm actually not sure what I think about this either. Maybe there was a sort of first phase of social awareness about race in America where there was a big emphasis on just getting the words right,
Right,
and
right.
people were saying words they really didn't understand. And you're talking about sort of deeper communication where we really look at values and we're not just worried about getting the words right. So maybe the PC fatigue had to do with getting the words right. Now we need to go deeper.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's, human nature is that when you feel like you're being yelled at or bashed down, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're right. If you're yelling at somebody or shutting them down to the point that they feel devalued and disrespected, they're not hearing you. So for me in the work, I'm really trying to help us think about how do we meet people where they're at. I mean, that's what education is. You don't teach someone algebra if they don't know arithmetic, and you don't teach someone calculus if they don't know algebra. So how do we meet people where they're at and take them on a journey and realize that it's going to take time. It's a process of learning and development. And how do we help them want to take ownership over that process and not just try to shove and force things down the throat that aren't really actually sitting with them, but they just feel like they have to say the words in order to be able to make everybody else comfortable.
I think what you're saying is very helpful. You're talking about a sort of local impact, which is possibly the best way to talk about this. But it does seem there needs to be a national dialogue about race. And I would have thought 8 years ago that with a black president and somebody so capable of this kind of discussion as Barack Obama is, that we would have seen that. Why haven't we had any thoughts? What would we need to do to have a national dialogue about race?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we learn in the work of social justice is that if we wanted racism to end, like if it was up to people of color, it'd already be over. If it was up to women, sexism would already be over. It's about the dominant group. So what the problem is that we have made racism a people of color issue. Racism is a white people issue. Sexism is a man issue. What do men need to do differently to stop perpetuating sexism in the society? And so, I think that we entered into the Obama era with this false illusion that he could. But the reality is that what we know is that people from marginalized identities, their voices are not heard by the dominant group in the same way as when somebody from the dominant group is taking responsibility and choosing to be an ally and recognizing that, okay, I have certain privileges by being a white person, and so therefore I need to really think about how can I help other white people.
I really like what you say about not hunting down the victims of racial aggression, but talk to the people that actually have the problem. Go back to the white people and the straight people who are intolerant and so on and so forth. Would Jose Antonio Vargas's White People be an example of what you're talking about, where he goes around to a couple of hundred campuses and talks to privileged white Americans until basically they begin to show their own racism? I think they even begin to see it.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I think that the learning process around this is a developmental process, and I think that really starts around self-awareness. And I think it's particularly important around white identity because white identity is not real. It was something constructed. It's a social construct that was created. People were Irish, Italian, German, they didn't come as white people, right? So there was a social process in this country that made people white, and there was economic reasons, and there was a kind of a process of assimilation to try to make people American. But in the process, there's been a cultural loss for a lot of people. I've been all over the world and in many places. You'll never meet people anywhere else outside of North America where people say, I don't have a culture, right? Everybody has a culture. And so if you understand that, wait a minute, okay, there's something that characterizes who I am and what I come from, and that gives me a reference point to understand who you are and who you come from. But if I don't understand who I am, how am I going to understand who you are? And so to me, that's where we got to start.
Let me go back to the beginning of what you just said. A cultural loss, is it part of the American experience that people lose a sense of their own past? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there was very specific things that happened around the elite class, the political class, and the economic class, and the way in which they were looking at labor and the immigration of Europeans specifically, and really feeling like they not get the economic benefit of ethnic enclaves, of Irish people sticking together,
Oh, okay.
of Italian people sticking together. There was no money to be made off them because they were circulating their dollars amongst each other, right? And so, and that's the reason why, actually Irish people were not considered to be white people originally. You had the phrase "Irish need not apply."
I think that's happened with a lot of groups too.
Yeah.
I'm more familiar with the Mexican American community,
Exactly.
and they have been white, they have been brown
Yeah.
at different times,
Yeah.
and then they've been their own race at other times. It really just
Yeah.
depends on political winds.
Exactly, because race is not real at the end of the day, but it has real implications because it's been constructed for specific purposes. And so, again, I think for a lot of people, there's a sense of loss of identity in this experience that people are having, especially around whiteness. And I think that the more people really kind of explore, okay, hold on, what is it that we did? When I grew up, what did we do? What are the things that we valued, and where did that come from? Because for me, it's really clear. I come from an Indian American. I'm an Indian American person from an immigrant family, and they make it really clear to me, what our culture is, where it comes from, why we do things the way that they do, and that gives me a reference point and a foundation for me to be able to try to better understand people as.
I've heard some researchers talk about the fact that when people know about their own past, the warts and the beauty and the horse thieves as well as the mayors of towns and so on, they're more inherently sympathetic with other people's situation.
Yeah.
The less they know about their own past, the more they see themselves as kind of monolithic and have unreal expectations of others.
Yeah, and that's a second main core competency I work on with people. So after self-awareness is empathy. So as you develop self-awareness, it becomes easier to actually shift perspectives and validate the experience of someone else as true for them, irrespective of what I think, right? And so that empathy is critical, because if I don't really value and understand who you are and what your experience is, it's going to be very difficult for me to truly be able to respect you and treat you the way that you deserve to be treated in any environment, hypothetically in an organizational environment.
Something that's really impactful in America right now is the discourse of the political candidates. I was going to mention one, but actually it's probably quite a few. Thoughts about that? What's the impact of that on Islamophobia?
Oh, I mean, it's been tremendously. I mean, as bad as I thought it was, this political campaign has really just has ramped things up, and it's really bringing out the worst out of people. It's rooted in fear. People don't fear what they don't understand, and they're being bombarded with images that are very narrow representations, and they're being bombarded with hate, and they're being told that. They're being given permission. That's the thing that's different right now, is that they're being told, and because we're hearing a lot, they're saying what I'm thinking, and what that is permission. Oh, I'm actually allowed to think and say that I hate Muslims now, even though you might never have met Muslims, and your only representation of it could be watching videos of ISIS or Al Qaeda, in your lifetime, and not recognizing that these people representationally are 0.0001% of the people.
If you could give people one message, just one thing you'd like them to think about that really relates to lessening this problem of Islamophobia, what would that one message be?
I do your research. Just do a little bit of an inquiry. It doesn't take that much. When I do my workshops on Islamophobia, within the first 2 PowerPoint slides, where I just share basic things like the 5 pillars of Islam, some basic myths about women's rights and specifically about like what the religion actually teaches. When I share some of those things with people, they're blown away. They're shocked. Within 10 minutes, I've already gotten people to be
past a lot of prejudices, right?
Yeah, they're like, wow, this actually is a religion of peace. And it's like, yeah, it is. And are there things that you can construe certain ways? Yeah, you can do that pretty much with any religion, and that's unfortunate that people do that. But
so look into it, get involved, and don't just go with
Absolutely.
sound bites you hear in the media.
Absolutely.
We're at the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity right now in San Francisco. What role do you think, constructive role, can organizations like NCORE, this National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, What good can they do?
Yeah, I mean, creating a platform. I mean, I've been thankful that they've helped create a platform for me and others to be able to talk about these issues before many others were, you know. And that's the thing, is that spaces like this, they lead. They help bring the discourse further along and bring other people along, so that more people know what a microaggression is, or more people know what Islamophobia is and what the implications are, or know more about Black Lives Matter and the issues related to Black Lives Matter. You know, it's important for spaces like this to be on out front.
Let me ask you to stick your neck out on something
Yeah.
just for a second here.
Yeah.
Fearless forecast. Look into the future as far as you can, 10 or 20 years. What do
Yeah.
you see as happening for Middle Easterners in general in the United States, Arab Americans, that, you know, good or bad? What do you see on the horizon out there?
I see a fork in the road, and you know, I think we, you know, as a country, we have a very big choice to make, and you know, I'm really concerned about the endorsement and the enabling and the alignment with people who are publicly advocating and preaching hate. And even if they try to walk it back a little bit to make it look like they're actually more, it is very dangerous to buy that and to believe that when the discourse is so deeply rooted in vilification and hatred. And if we let that happen, I'm concerned about the historical examples that we have in the past, including Germany. And I know that that's dangerous territory, but it's that scary to me. I feel like I'm looking at something like that. And so that's, to me, the worst case scenario. And the best case scenario is that we find a way to be Americans, and that we start to understand that this country needs to be for everybody, and a space for everybody, that we honor our indigenous people, that we respect our immigrants, that we recognize that we need all of us to do this well in this country, and the demonization of any of us really damages us in the world landscape.
Dr. Amer Ahmed, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am so glad that you could be with us today. Join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.